Well, I'm in the mood to make some trees for my HO shelf layout. It's been a while since I got any work done. Other things got in the way. But I've got 3 different types of trees here, and they're very easy to make, a lot of fun. And if it looks like something you'd like to try for your layout, stick around and I'll show you how I made these. Let me just say before we get started that I don't really model for the camera. I build my models basically to look okay from the human perspective, not necessarily the tiny detail that would be needed for the lens on the camera. Well, let's start with the tall pines. Let's take a closer look at some of the detail on this tall pine. I put a little nail, you can use a cut-off nail or even a piece of toothpick, drilled up and glued into the bottom so it makes it easier to mount the tree on the layout. You can see I've got some bark detail here, some dead branches, and then the foliage. Well, the very first step in making a tall pine tree for your HO layout is to go to your favorite Chinese restaurant and bring home the chopsticks. If you don't want to do that, then some small dowels will work just fine, or even an old handle from a paintbrush. So let's head out into the shop and make some sawdust. Well, if you're like me, short attention span and extremely lazy, then you like to make each task as easy as possible. So here's a chopstick, and here's a little dowel. I've got a little collection of them here. So let's start with this little dowel. We want to put a gentle taper, especially on the top half. So let's fire up our little sanding machine here and make a mess. All right, that didn't take long. Next, take any kind of a little saw that you have, and what we're going to do is we're going to make longitudinal scratches and gouges in this little trunk. Just kind of beat it up with the saw, or you could use a file, but something that'll take some nice gouges out of it. Okay, let's head back inside. So we want to drill a small hole in the bottom of the trunk so that we can put a little piece of toothpick or cut-off nail. There we go, got that super glued in. Okay, let's set this aside. For the next step, we're going to need some cocoa liner. You can get this at most hardware stores or big box stores, and it's used to line hanging baskets. It's very fibrous and natural looking. Well, let's cut this up into some small squares. And then let's kind of round them. Clip off any of the square edges. We're going to treat these little pieces like English muffins, and we're going to split them apart. Just see if you can divide them in half. So each one will make sort of 2 little pancakes. So now what we're going to do is to take each of these and wiggle and tease them and spread them out. They're a little dense right now, so we want to open up the fibers. We don't want to rip it apart, but we want to open up that real dense matte look and make it a little sparser look. All right, let's pick up our little pancakes here and head back out to the shop. Now I'm going to hit the upper half of the trunk with some 3M77. So now we'll take our little pancakes and we'll slide them onto the trunk. A symphony by Carl. So next, I've got a few little dead twigs that I got in the backyard. We have to add some dead branches here just below where the foliage is. So we'll take a small drill, we'll put a few holes in here, and cut off some tiny pieces of dead wood here, and we'll glue them in. Okay, so we have a few dead and drooping branches. I'll probably trim their length later, but I'm going to let this glue set up. I'm using a fast setting white glue, but let's set this aside for a few minutes. Well, let's give this guy a little bit of a haircut, trying to avoid making it look like topiary, so we want to keep it somewhat irregular. All right, let's go back out to the shop. All right, let's hit it with a little Rust-Oleum Rusty Metal Primer. It's just kind of a brown that I have on the shelf here. Time now for a little Super 77 adhesive spray. Now to sprinkle on some coarse medium green turf. And then after another light spray of adhesive, some green blended turf. Well, we're just about done with this tall pine. As a final treatment, I'm going to take some tan paint and we'll dry brush, and we're just ever so gently going to hit some highlights on the trunk. We don't want to fill in the grooves or anything. Just to bring out some of the texture in the trunk. And there we are. Okay, next on the list, a small pine tree like this. For this next tree, we're going to need some coarse natural twine and some fine floral wire. Well, let's take each of these little clumps and we're going to roll them with our fingers and twist and basically separate these fibers. Well, as you can see, I kind of got carried away. It doesn't take much twine to make enough branches for, there's probably 4, 5, or 6 trees worth here. But that's okay. When you're working on the layout, you're going to make multiple trees. So it's best to do things in groups anyway. It's just more efficient. Next, let's make some wire loops. So we'll take some of this wire, it's pretty thin, and double it over. And that will be approximately the height of each tree that we would want to make. Well, I don't know if you can see this well on camera, but the wire makes a loop. It goes up, around, and back down. And so this will be the top of the tree, and this will be the base of the trunk. So I'm going to grab just some pliers and hold on to where the base is. And then I'm going to grab the top. We want to keep this loop open on the top for now. And let's just do overall maybe 5 or 6 twists at the most. Not too many. Okay, just like that. So what we're going to do is take these fibers and we're going to thread them through the big loop in the top, maybe give them another roll or two to fray them out a little more, and then shove them down the wire, and it will look something like this. Okay, this is looks like a pretty small tree, but it's almost the size of a house in HO scale. So we'll start down here, maybe with some longer fibers at the bottom of the tree. Give them another roll maybe to separate them again. Shove them through the loop. Slide them down toward the base of the tree, just like that. Grab another bunch here. Give another couple of twists. It's a bit fiddly, I know. Well, as you can see, it's kind of messy. But here's 3 little tree forms here. And at this point, if you want to, you could take some scissors and maybe trim a little bit of a taper into these. You can do it later, you can do it now. Don't want to get too carried away. Now here comes the fun part. You'll like this. I've got my pliers holding the base of the tree, and I'm going to slip the loop at the top through a curved piece of metal in my drill and crank away. Keep a little tension on the wire, and look what happens. The fibers all spread, and you end up with a conically shaped tree. Here's our tiny little pine trees. So let's head back out to the shop. Time for a little green spray paint. A little light dusting of Super 77 adhesive spray. And a sprinkling of some fine turf. Three new little pine trees. The last project for this video is going to be making a tree like this in the back, a leafy tree. It's not a conifer. And for this type of tree, we're going to start with an old dead twig from the backyard. This, I think, is leftover lavender from last year. But it's got some nice little busy trunk activity, and maybe even some roots that we can salvage here. So to start, let's trim off some of these branches and get just sort of a general tree shape going. Now this one is looking a bit lopsided. Most of the branches are on this side over here. If it's going to go on the back of the layout, that really doesn't make any difference. But let's pretend we want a little fullness, and maybe we could add a branch in this area. So we'll drill a hole in the trunk, and we'll take a piece of this other branch and glue it in. So I was able to drill a couple holes in the trunk, one here, and glued in a couple of branch pieces. And then while the glue was still wet around the base where I glued it in, I sprinkled some sawdust from my table saw in the shop, cut this off with a hobby saw, and drilled a hole in the bottom and glued in a little piece of toothpick here, which will help us mount it on the layout. And you can see we were able to save a couple little pieces that will simulate some roots, and save this little piece that we cut off. That's going to be a great looking stump that I'll mount somewhere on the layout as well. Alrighty, for this next step, we can use either a quilting batten material like this, or I happen to have some Woodland Scenics fibrous batting that is already green. So let's use this. So let's just do our best to tease it out really, really thin and sparse. And then we'll see if we can drape it over these branches. All right, let's run back out to the shop. And just a little light spray of adhesive 3M77. And then a little blended turf. And with just a very, very light spray again with adhesive, I'm going to sprinkle on some burnt grass fine turf. And then just a really tiny bit of fine turf yellow grass, just for some highlights. And there you have it, some happy little trees all ready to find their place on my layout. I hope you enjoyed watching and got inspired to make some trees for your layout. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.